The wking D8 has long been the budget boombox of choice for those looking for a cheaper option to the extremely priced JBL Extreme range of speakers. We have the D8 and along comes the 60-watt alternative, the wking D9, 50 watts on paper. The wking D8, we have the wking D9. I have taken off the grills because I wanted to show you the difference in the drivers. And as you can see, we've got bigger woofers in the wking D9, same size tweeters, so we actually do have separate tweeters, smaller woofers in the wking D8. But the big difference is dual passive radiators, one on each side for the wking D8, and the wking D9 is one big passive radiator. And I was interested, what does that mean in terms of surface area? It's quite important with passive radiators to make sure it displaces a bigger volume than the woofers. So we've got bigger drivers, we're going to need a bigger passive radiators. Look to me, maybe, I wonder if there's less surface area. I actually calculated, we've got 78 square centimeters of surface area on the passive radiators on the wking D8. Got 107 square centimeters on the D9. So yes, on paper, bigger surface area for the single passive radiator, bigger woofers, a bigger amp, apparently 60 watts versus 50 watts. Of course, many ways you could measure that and skew the figures, but on paper, it's looking like it could be the new powerhouse, the new budget boombox of choice, because in terms of price, not much in it. At the moment, they seem to be about £70 in the UK for the D8, about 80 quid with a discount for the wking D9. Now, it's only just come out already. There is this firmware update. I've done the firmware update. I think it's a long name, and the important bit seems to be the EQ bit where it says 1202 from memory, I believe. And so have they just tweaked the EQ for the firmware update? Well, no. You can see these well hidden under the handle controls. We did have a blue LED. Let me turn it on. So there's a blue LED that normally tells you what's going on there. I don't know if you can see that because even for me, it's hidden under the handle. But now when you go to max volume, it goes red. And that was the other big deal about this update. However, people weren't glowing about the wking D9 in its original version. So straight away, I did the firmware update. And of course, I've compared frequency response before with frequency response after to see exactly what we got. Before the firmware update, after. Before, after. So it looks a bit flatter before the update because we seem to have less mids, so they can add more to the upper bass, not necessarily the deep bass, in its default mode. So default mode, a bit more bass, a bit less clarity. EQ mode, a bit more bass after the firmware update, but they've robbed the big peak which they had at 2 kilohertz. So again, less clarity, and again around the 6 kilohertz. So more bass, less clarity is what you're going to get with this firmware update. Whoopie doopie, we got more bass. But hang on a sec, it's upper bass. Well, we already had some upper bass. So weirdly, highly upper bass oriented. They've robbed of some of the mids, so we've got less clarity. We've got more upper bass, not particularly flat. Well, it's not looking that promising, although it does look like it's going to go a bit louder. So overall specs, actual comparison. I've talked about the price. Obviously, this has just come out, whereas the D8 is 2 years old. So now we have an 8,000 milliamp hour battery versus a 12,000 milliamp hour battery. Converts to 29.6 watt hours, 44 watt hours. 12,000 milliamps of battery is a big old battery, whether that's actually 3.7 or 7.4 volts, I'm not sure, but 44.4 watt hours is a big old battery. As we would expect, both SBC codec, both Bluetooth 5, both do stereo pairing, both have USB-C connections, both have auxiliary inputs, both can be used as a power bank, but only the wking D9 can be used to make your phone calls. Only the wking D9 has a micro SD card slot on the back, so you can play music straight off the micro SD. I never used to mention that. Apparently, a lot of you quite like that feature. So I'm mentioning it, 50 watts versus 60 watts. 2.4 kilos versus 2.7 kilos, so a little bit heavier. XPX5 versus, I got a notification, XPX5 versus IPX6, which means a little bit waterproof, but nicely splash proof, but not, can't drop it in water or you're in trouble. Weirdly, they claim 60 to 20 kilohertz for the wking D8. They're only claiming 80 to 20 kilohertz. They're either extremely honest, or what was the point of a bigger, more powerful speaker? In terms of those drivers, two 85mm woofers versus two 65mm woofers, both have 25mm tweeters, two passive radiators, one big passive radiator. In terms of latency, my YouTube testing, 130 milliseconds versus 150 milliseconds. They managed to make it even worse on the newer speaker. A lot of these cheap speakers, it's not their greatest hour when it comes to latency. Neither of these are very usable for YouTube, but the D8 is a little bit better than the D9. I showed you the difference between pre-firmware, post-firmware. I'll show you the difference frequency response between the two of them. Default mode wking D9, default mode D8. Way more upper bass, as you can see, is the tuning after firmware update for the D9, and the wking D8 looking a bit flatter, a bit more reasonable. Still has a boosted bass, but more extension and a flatter looking sound. Looks like there the D9 is going louder. EQ modes, D8 extends higher at the high end. It looks flatter, even though it's the EQ mode, and it's reducing quite drastically the lower bass. But the D9, it looks like it's not quite sure if it just wants more highs or more upper bass, or do we want to go louder, or it looks a bit of a mess, if I'm honest. D8 looking like it's a little bit more balanced. The D9 looking like, if you like your upper bass, you're in luck. Looks like it will probably go a bit louder, but doesn't look overly balanced in sound. So we're going to have a quick listen. Moderate listening volumes, 50%.
We don't feel like it. We don't feel like it. 'Cause we don't feel like throwing it all away. We don't feel like it. We both have thoughts of leaving when thoughts get thrown around. But we keep going on believing, and on till we're all cried out. 'Cause we don't feel like throwing it all away. We don't feel like it. But this time it's not about escaping. We don't feel like it. We don't feel like it.
You know, the D8 has not been a particularly clear speaker in all my tests at low volume, low to moderate volumes. Yet in this AB, actually almost sounds, you know, like it's got a bit more sparkle and a bit more balanced. We know that isn't really the case. Quite heavily slanted to the lower bass in these tests. However, certainly has more sparkle than the D9, massively upper bass heavy on the D9. has a big roll off from 10 kilohertz, doesn't extend very far. I am doing both of these in default mode. I'm only going to use the EQ mode, or outdoor mode as we've come to know these modes, at maximum volume. So these are default modes, like for like. At these volume, at 50%, we're struggling to see what the point of the D9 was, to be quite honest with you. So let's go straight to 75% volume.
Looks like we've come to the end of the road. There's no point in running away now. I'd rather sleep until the storm is gone. She'd rather be shooting at me now. I know it will end up in anger. I don't think we grew up, we just became older. She's aiming her words, ready to fire. I don't think that bullets will bring back desire. I don't think that bullets will bring back desire. Like a blink of an eye's not enough. She'd rather be staying for days now. I'd rather fix it than mess up again. She'd rather be burning it all now. I know it will end up in anger. I don't think we grew up, we just became older. She's aiming her words, ready to fire. I don't think that bullets will bring back desire.
I think the girls with their nails done now. Girls with their nails done. I think the girls with their nails done. Girls with their girls with their nails done now. Girls with their nails done. Girls with their nails done. Girls with their girls with their nails done now. Girls with their nails done now.
D8 75%, D9 70%, because the D9 plays slightly louder, so 70 matches 75% on these speakers. In terms of bass, the D9 offers a little bit more in the upper bass. Minus 27 at 170 Hz, minus 30 means 3 dB up in upper bass for the D9. By 85 Hz, they are the same. Don't forget, this is when they are volume matched. By 65 Hz, it's a 1 dB advantage to the D8. 50 Hz, it's neck and neck. But 40 Hz, 5 dB up for the D8. So at the moment, we're struggling to see the advantages to buying the D9, other than it looks like it goes a bit louder. But we've got less lower bass. We do have a little bit more in the mids, but rapid roll off again from 10 kilohertz and over, where the D8, we've got that 13 kilohertz peak on the D8, which we see with the JBL Extreme 3, making a big difference between the D9 and the D8. Certainly in terms of clarity, the D8 certainly extends more into the highs. However, you will notice the D8 does play noisier. We've got a lot more noise going on. The D9 plays cleaner. So I'm really not getting it. So we had the strap on the D8. We've got, again, a Chinese speaker with an integrated. It's clearly cheaper to produce them with an integrated handle, plastic, unruggedly handle, than have a nice strap that you can put around your shoulders. So I'm struggling to see the point. The controls are well hidden under the handle. I don't find it very user-friendly. 75%, would you be using that over the D8? You know, when it's volume for volume, you know, when it's matched and you just want a bit more bass or a bit deeper bass or a little bit more melodical. What does this offer at 50, 75% that you're not already getting from the D9 or better on the D8, sorry, that you're not already getting on the D8? No clarity, no sparkle, no deep bass. And it's a D9. Why give it a D9? Why, I don't know. If this, maybe they should have made this 50 quid and just said, oh, well, it's a cheap alternative to the D8 with bigger drivers, so your friends think you've got a bigger speaker. Look, maybe maximum volume is the one where it all becomes clear. So let's go 100% volume.
Life's better when you're on top, baby. Drink me up like I'm a cherry pop. Oh, your rhythm gonna make my candy rock, baby. I'ma be a cougar when you be my silver fox. We could be electric, I could fuck you in the shock. If you wanna go, you're never gonna wanna stop, honey. Oh, baby, with my love, set me on fire in your arms. Oh, baby, with my love. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top. Life's better when you're on top. If I'm on a work, you then I'd rather be the boss. Send you to your Danny if you wanna grease me up, baby. I'll call you baby quick, baby, maybe we can spark. If you're gonna ride, take me to the body shop. If I go fast, you can cut me like a cup, daddy. Oh, baby, with my love, set me on fire in your arms. Oh, baby, with my love. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top, on top. Life is better when you're on top. Life is better when you're on top.
Maximum volume, wking D9, it does play louder in perceived terms, in RMS terms as well, and also by peak. It goes louder, goes cleaner. You can see how much noise there is in the low end on that wking D8. It also finally has a bit more bass than the D8, so down to minus 38 at 50 Hertz. That's about 4 dB up on D8 in its EQ mode, its noisiest mode. 6 dB up with the D8 in default mode. And while EQ mode on the D9 is brighter, more forward mids, stronger in the high end, it's cutting its lower bass, and it isn't going louder. Not strictly in perceived loudness terms. In LUFS, it's a little bit behind. The default mode, 12.1, 12.4, makes EQ mode slightly softer. A big difference in terms of RMS by over a decibel. Peaks are about the same, and it's got a lot less bass. EQ mode works on the D8 the way you'd expect it to, goes louder by robbing the deeper bass and adding it elsewhere, so-called outdoor modes, but default mode with the new firmware seems to go louder on wking D9. So that's the weird thing, is that the outdoor mode is quieter than the default mode. I mean, that was after the firmware update where they wanted a bit more bass and they've reduced some of those highs, which of course will make it a little bit quieter. So what was the point? What was the point of that, of changing the EQ in the firmware update? I really don't. So, all right, why would you get the D9? You get it because it does go blooming loud. It goes louder than the already loud wking D8. It goes loud, and when you go to the ultimate maximum volumes, you do get more bass than even in the EQ or default mode on the D8. So ultimately, it doesn't sound better, but it goes louder, and you would ultimately get more bass on the D9 if you play your D8 95%, 100% volume the D9, I guess, will be an upgrade for you. It will go louder. Your neighbours will be banging on your wall even more, or you're outdoors, you're going to hear it a little bit more clearly. The D8 it is not the cleanest of sounding speakers by a long chalk, especially when you go to EQ mode. You really hear the distortion. The distortion's there all the time, but you really hear it mostly EQ mode, maximum volume. Whereas it does play cleaner on the D9, but it's not a fantastic sounding speaker. The only thing I can say about this is it goes louder and you will get more bass. But if you're not listening at maximum volumes, there is no real reason to get the wking D9. The wking D8 does sound better. So, I don't know. I mean, a big disappointment to me. Not very exciting. Normally there's something good you can say, but I would never listen to this. Why would I listen to this? Other than I want my loudest speaker, but then I'll get a bigger speaker still. It'll sound good and loud. So, I don't know. It looks better. Take the grill off. Your mates will say, yeah, you've got bigger woofers than I've got on my speaker. But they'll say I've got a strap I can put over my shoulder, and you'll say, well, if it rains, my controls are sheltered by the handle. So, wking D9 versus wking D8. I hope you got something out of this video. I'm not quite sure, other than maybe you've saved yourself a few quid, because unless you're going to maximum volume, I doubt you'll be buying it. So, thank you for watching.